In this film, the 1941 invasion of Soviet Ukraine by Nazi Germany is shown through the life of the inhabitants of a Yiddish village at the border of Poland. The film depicts the lives of a Jewish shtetl in a 24-hour period before Operation Barbarossa. It was filmed in the Ukraine 6 months before the 2022 Russian invasion. Now, I don't want to share any more because the film is more than cinema. It's an experience. We're honored to be able to present programs like today's because our mission is not only to entertain you, but to share films that imprint your memory and help create a deeper understanding of humanity through a Jewish lens. This film will definitely leave its mark on your psyche. Now, I would like to turn the mic over to our distinguished guest, Saul Rubinek.
This is the first dramatic film made with actors that this writer-director has done. He made documentaries before this. So this is a first. He doesn't speak Yiddish. He speaks French and English, had to get translated. There were only 3 legitimate Yiddish speakers in this film, and I count for about 30% of my Yiddish. And then Lily and Moshe and me, we translated our stuff into his French into English, and then Lily and Moshe translated it all into Yiddish. That's how it all worked.
How long
and I got involved because, as I say, I was desperate, to make no money and go back to Ukraine, where I'd done another movie there, and I loved being there, and I loved the crew, not all of whom are alive.
Yeah, can you talk about that?
But I tell you, I wasn't back there. I mean, I went there in 2015, right after Maidan, right after the first, when they kicked out the first, puppet president. We kicked him out, and I met all these extraordinary Ukrainians. I was there 10 years ago doing another film, a French film. And I met all these people. I was there for 2.5 months. And then when he asked me to go back, we were all in COVID. We were all, do you remember this? All disinfecting our groceries. So we were all bored out of our minds. And I had an opportunity to go. I mean, the fact that there was no money for salary, it was just that they paid my fare, and I got to be in a hotel and be there for a couple of weeks. And it was just such a relief to work again, and then to work on this. Look, I mean, this may seem, I'm a child of Holocaust survivors. I'm born in a refugee camp. My first language is Yiddish. So you would think, right, that this is incredibly meaningful. Yes, I had my ancestors on my shoulders doing this. However, I'm an actor, and I've been an actor since I was 7 years old. When it came to doing this role, I wasn't thinking about anything that I wouldn't be thinking about on a guest star role of a Law and Order episode. I swear to you, I was only thinking about the moment and the scene and my scene partner the way I would with any other role. And I let everything else, all of the extraordinary history of this, the script, the circumstances, the single shot, the black and white, I had no control of that. I had only in control of one thing, like any actor knows here, who's an actor in this room, is that the only thing I can control was whether I was truthful in the moment. And the fact that I was doing it in Yiddish, wearing what I was wearing, I had to forget about all that. I'd forget about my ancestors. I had to forget about everything but what was happening in that moment. So the role was one of the easiest roles I've ever played. It was like falling off a log. I'm working with somebody who's fluent in Yiddish, who is the role. I mean, Moshe really lived it, given his background, right? He lived it. And when I was in his presence, I followed along, even though it was his first film, I kind of followed him. And it was a very simple thing. What was difficult was rehearsing it. What was excruciatingly difficult was rehearsing it. Rehearsring 2 scenes like that, for me, I can only imagine how hard it was for Moshe, and for Antoine, who plays Folia, who the 2 big roles. But for me, it was like a play, and I'm working with a cinematographer who doesn't work with Western actors, which means actors are told what to do and they do it. in Eastern Europe, so he wasn't used to this Hollywood guy, or Western actor. And I'm working with directors, never directed actors, as brilliant as he was, and so rehearsals were difficult. I mean, we're going to talk about that after this, because it's just other people. But it was difficult, but worth it, but difficult. But shooting it and playing it, falling off a log.
So I want to talk, going back to your Yiddish, how much of it was scripted and how much of it, given the fact that you had this, relationship with Mendele, with Moshe, who's fluent in Yiddish, was some of it ad-libbed?
Well, when you're doing, the only ad-libs that happened anywhere in this movie are between Moshe and, at that time, Eli Rosen, who were both fully fluent, a little bit, but he's not really a professional, but Eli Lilly now was not at the time really a professional actor as much as a consultant and a translator, but since then is, but improvising would have been too difficult. I improvised a little with Moshe, but the script, we'd already worked really hard on the script and the moments and what was going on. Where I had to improvise was where I lost the Yiddish words. And I'll give you an example. This is funny. I mean, this second scene that I'm in, I don't know if you guys remember this, but there's a big argument outside the synagogue after Sabbath, right? And all these guys are outside the synagogue and they're arguing for 6.5 pages. And then I interrupt them and I said to Adi, the director, I said, "Have you lost your mind? You have somebody walk in front of the camera just before I start my scene. I've got another 7 pages here, and some of it's a monologue. A lot of it's a monologue." I said, "Give me a break." He said, "What is the problem?" I said, "The problem is that if I fuck up, I'm going to destroy the 6 and 7 pages they just did. And they're young actors. And I'm going to screw them up. I mean, I may not get this take well. And I may screw up. But I think it will be fine." No, Adi, it won't be fine. And you need to have somebody walk in front of the camera. That's all you need. Somebody walking closely in front of the camera. It happens a few times here, where they make cuts that are invisible. You just walk in front of the camera. There's 9 people out there. Anybody can walk in front of the camera. Well, I don't want to do that. Okay, so the very first take, they were great. They nailed it in their first take. They'd rehearsed it a lot. And they were young and enthusiastic and dying to do it. And it was a big argument scene and they had to walk in and had to be choreographed. They'd all rehearsed it. Rehearsing this is not, by the way, you don't rehearse this stuff on the day. You rehearse this a whole day before you shoot this, or 2 days, or 3 days. And then when you shoot it, you already know what the dance is, and the music. And the other person that you're dancing with is, William Ogre, the operator. So they nail it. I come out, my first line is, "I'm not just the rabbi of the observant," which is, "Ich bin nicht bloß der Rebbe von der Fremme. Ich bin nicht bloß der Rebbe von der Fremme. Bin ich bloß der Rebbe from the," and in my mind is going, I'm about to say, "I'm not just the rabbi of the," what's the word for observant? I mean, Frimme was gone. And they had just done 6.5 pages. So I said, they're all looking at me. And I'm standing there going, I could just cut, but fuck. Ich bin dein Rebbe, ja oder nein? I'm your rabbi, yes or no, was all I could come up with. And not that hard to say in Yiddish. And they don't speak Yiddish. And they're looking at me, they don't have a line here. Ja oder nein? And Eli is there, the only one who speaks Yiddish. Ja. And they all start going, yeah, you're my rabbi. I'm your rabbi, yes or no, is what I'm saying. Because I'm stalling to come up with the word frimme, which I do. And the scene goes on. And Adi has no idea that I've been improvising. He doesn't speak Yiddish. So the scene is over. He said, that was very good, I think, no? I said, have somebody walk in front of the fucking camera. Because I fucked up. He said, did not look like you fucked up to me. I told him what happened. He said, well, that sounds really good. Do that again. What did you say? I said, am I your rabbi? Yes or no? That's very good. Do that. That's very good. So I did it every take. But he wouldn't put somebody in front of the camera. Finally, we all had a great take, and I thought I'd done my best take. And he said, Saul, we have a problem. Oh my God. The actors, the young actors, yeah, they think they can do better. Well, I can't do better. I just did my, I peaked, okay? I peaked. I've done 7 takes of a 9-page monologue. I'm done. Well, do you want to go tell them that? Jesus Christ. Okay, let's do another take. And the last take is what you got here.
I want to turn to Michael Berenbaum. So our audience, most of you, I would say, are familiar with Michael and his work. Michael is the foremost expert on the Holocaust. And I know that if the two of you started talking...
My father would disagree with that.
Okay. I'll give him that. But I want, Michael, this is your first time seeing this film. So I would like you to weigh in on it, and if you have any questions directly for Saul, please fire away.
Well, I think, first of all, I think it's a wonderful film. And it captures a moment. Let me do what a pain in the ass historian can do. Let me put it a little bit in context. Let me do what a pain in the rear end, what plain historian can do, which is to put it a little bit in context. The shtetl was on the verge of collapse. And it was on the verge of collapse both because people were leaving for economic reasons. They were leaving, for a century, they were leaving to America from 1881 through 1924. Some groups were leaving to Palestine, and I don't mean that politically, I mean that in terms of pre-state Israel. And others were leaving to go to the big city. And the other part of the shtetl was that the Soviets essentially destroyed the shtetl. And the greatest of the Israeli scholars of the Holocaust, Yehuda Bauer, wrote The Death of the Shtetl. And that is within the very short period of time. The Soviet Union occupied this territory in September 1939, and it occupied it until June of 1941. That's it. And in that time, they essentially dismantled the economic basis of the shtetl. The other part that you saw is at the end, the arrival of the Germans. This is called the mobile killing units, or what we now call the Holocaust by bullets. And that is that the first stage of the Holocaust is to go with mobile killers to stationary victims and to kill them within the vicinity of their homes, to a valley, to a wadi, to a gulf, and essentially to murder them one by one, bullet by bullet, village, town, hamlet, city, all of it. Even Kiev, if you remember your history, September 27th to 29th, 33,791 Jews were killed in Babi Yar. Now that gives you a sense of magnitude, but they started here. To fill in the story of the Holocaust in only 1 second is to say when they then had too many Jews to kill that way, and it was tough on the killers, they reversed the process and they made the victims mobile and the killing centers stationary. The victims became mobile by trains, and the killing centers became the combination of Charles Darwin and Henry Ford. meaning survival of the fittest, and essentially Henry Ford, the assembly line and the depersonalization of killing. The other element of it that I thought they captured magnificently is how everybody knew everybody and everything about everybody in the shtetl. And that is, there was no zone of privacy. And the other thing is, to leave is to, as it were, to betray. And the question again that the father, you had this with Mendel, question of the father is, once you leave, and he assures his father, Ich bin a Yid. And that is that he didn't go throw everything out completely. But again, and you felt this, when he sang, he became there. And he returned. But father and son, what's called a mismeeting. They went in different directions. The other interesting thing is, if you know Yiddish well, you understood how well these people worked at getting their Yiddish. And you could tell who had it authentically, who had it phonetically, but they worked like hell to get it. And by the way, if you see Fiddler on the Roof in Yiddish, and it's going to be coming here for an extended stay, you'll see the same thing. But the irony is, the Cossacks sound like Cossacks because the Russian is authentic to them. And let's also say this, that the Ukrainians historically were enormously lethal in their treatment of Jews. And that is that the Ukrainians essentially, Soviet soldiers were captured, Ukrainian soldiers turned to collaborate with the Germans, so the surrounding of the Warsaw Ghetto was German troops and Ukrainian auxiliaries, and Ukrainians were present in Auschwitz as part of the staff of Auschwitz and the like. So the tension between Ukrainians and Jews was deep. And we'd have to say politically it's a miracle that Ukraine has a Jewish president. And by the way, a Jewish president whose one grandfather fought for the Soviet Union in the Red Army, and whose other father was killed in the mobile killing units. So it's not an accident. But we're not here to talk history. I think this is a fabulous film. And I think that you did a magnificent job. And the other part of it is the script writing, the idea that the Rebbe wrestled with faith and doubt, and that allowed him to become a Rebbe. That's masterful. And notice the other character, right? Couldn't be a Rebbe because he couldn't relate beyond that. And the line that you improvised, "Am I your Rebbe?" that becomes a question of how do you negotiate a village that is collapsing?
Well, I can tell you one thing. I had this interesting discussion with Adi, and I'm proud of 3 words that I wrote. And he said, the second scene wasn't making sense to me. At least I knew that I was interrupting this fight of all these people disparate, and I knew that he had this idea that I wasn't just the Rebbe of the observant, I was the Rebbe of the town, which means the Rebbe of atheists and feminists and anti-Zionists and Zionists and crazy people and not crazy people, that I'm a village leader, which means that I'm not supported by everybody. I have to support everybody. That's what being a leader is. is to support everyone else. My grandfather, who I never met, was not a Rebbe. He was a Dayan, which means the Jews, and he was in a big city, Polish Manchester was kind of the city of Łódź, or the Jews pronounced it Lodge. A large city, industrial city, and the Jews didn't like to go to Polish civil courts, so they had magistrates that were Jews, and he was a Dayan, but he was also highly respected in the community. I knew something about the Rebbe world, and my father had left it to become an actor, and I knew something about it. And I'd also played at least 2 other rabbis in my life, Hasidic rabbis. And this is not a Hasidic rabbi. This is a Rebbe. He's not a rabbi by genealogy, and he's not like the towns. They call them the Kasrilivka Rebbe because of the town. That's not who he was. He didn't have a cult following him. This Rebbe. He was just the rabbi of the village of that particular town. So what was interesting was when we were discussing this scene, I said, this was back in May, we were going to shoot in August, and I said, what are you trying to get at? And he said, well, that you want to see Moshe take over his biblical sayings so that he's, yes, but what is he going to talk about? He's going to talk about the fact that Moshe Rabbeinu lifted his hands against the Amaleks, against their enemies, and he was going to say that unity matters, and the rabbi says, yes, and what about faith? And he says, well, I have faith in stories, in telling stories. I said, Adi, I think that's what I've got to say. I've got to put that down. I don't think he should say, he's already had a scene where he's talked about, he already have a line early in the script that he wants to tell lots of stories, not just one story, to other people. He's already talked about how much he loves the art of it and why he's left. I think that I've got to he's left faith out. And I don't think the answer is that he's got stories that are going to replace faith. And so I think I need to say, well, what are you going to replace it with? And I think I need to come after him, especially since we had such a nice time laughing together about Tarzan in the scene earlier. And I said, and we're going to be joking about it, and you're going to know that I love him and I respect him. But he's saying something that I can't understand. Unity, yes, but unity without faith is what? What are you left with? Darkness, choshech. And he said, so what are you suggesting? I said, when I say, what are you going to replace it with? Bubba Mises, grandmother stories, Tarzan? And then what do you want him to say? I want him to say with a gun. He said, holy fuck. I said, yeah. I said, we had not had October 7th. And this was 2021. And I said, we have this country, for good or ill, because I'm not going to talk politics about this, that has a nuclear bomb, not a gun. And I said, and we've got to prefigure, this is, everything that happens in this film, Adi, is still alive. They're all going to be dead. But there's not one discussion, not one argument, not one love affair, not one elopement, not one joke, not one art. Everything is still alive, somewhere, in our people, and in all people who have been killed, all communities, and all genocides throughout the world. There isn't a moment in history where genocide isn't being committed somewhere for the last 70,000 years. So I said, so whatever has been killed is alive somewhere. And I said, so what is alive here is this idea. He's wearing a uniform. He's wearing a soldier's uniform. How do you put him in a soldier's uniform? He said, I'm worried about saying that line. I said, I think it's going to make the scene. And I think it'll make the scene in a very important way, because he's prefiguring the solution. And he said, and the answer, of course, is what the Rebbe would say. You don't need me to have an answer to it, but the answer is then we become like them, which is what all of these religious Jews would have thought. Not in the village. Some of them would have said, yeah, take a gun. But if you were an Eastern European religious Orthodox Hasidic Jew, or even non-Hasidic Jew, if you took up a gun, of course, many did, right? There was a lot of resistance. Look at the Warsaw Ghetto. But if you took up a gun, you become like them. Violence is not the answer. In fact, in Jewish mythology, the Golem mythology, is you cannot have a Messiah without the violent Messiah being put down first. Jacob is the violent Messiah, the Golem. My father played him. I was born on opening night of the Golem in a refugee camp. In Jewish mythology, the violent Messiah must be put down, or you cannot have David, the real Messiah. You cannot go to the promised land. That's Jewish mythology. And so that's what that. I'm really. It's a very interesting moment in the scene. But
it's more. Let's also say it's more than Jewish mythology. It's one of the substructures of the debates that are taking place in contemporary Israel.
Sure.
Including the messiness, we see a deterioration of the situation as the prefiguration of its solution. And you have it in all sorts of ways taking place, and the Israelis will see that line very, very differently in a very real way. And the question I have for you, Saul, has this played in Israel?
I don't know. Do you know?
I don't know.
I don't think the distributor is here. I don't know. I don't know.
Because one of the things that would be very interesting to see is the different reaction in Israel to the very same things.
Well, I don't know if this audience knows. Yiddish is considered a language of victims in Israel.
Oh.
Yiddishkeit. So this is certainly after the creation of the state of Israel. They wanted Jews to not speak Yiddish there. I mean, unless you were a Hasidic world where that's what they speak, fine. Those Hasidim could be off in whatever group or community they could speak Yiddish. But the idea of being a citizen of Israel meant that you were going to get rid of the language of the ghetto. You were going to get rid of the language of the victims, and you were going to learn Hebrew. The irony of that is, of course, that modern Hebrew is not more than 120 years old, whereas Yiddish, which is German, which has got the same root as English, Yiddish, it just happens to be written phonetically right to left with Hebrew letters, but Yiddish and English have the same root. Yiddish is German, period. It's the German language. Yiddish is to German what Ebonics is to English plus 1,000 years. Okay? And Yiddish is a 1,000-year-old very rich language, whereas Hebrew is not. People don't speak the language of the Bible in Israel. They don't speak a combination of poetic Aramaic and Hebrew. Yiddish is, in fact, a far more profound language, and a far deeper language than modern Hebrew. But the Israelis didn't like it, and they haven't liked it for 3 generations. So there's a tremendous amount of research into the kind of words that would have been spoken, and I'm not an expert in how well they did. Something came up that's really interesting that you might be interested in, guys. There was a question yesterday at the Royal Theatre, and somebody talked about Ukrainians the way you did just now, and I got upset with it. Not that you're not accurate, but I got upset. And the reason I got upset, they said, I hear the Ukrainians welcomed the Nazis. This woman got up and I said, there's a joke that Conan O'Brien made that the French spent a lot more time fighting Disney than they did Hitler. And there's accuracy to it. Every country welcomed the Germans in one way or another. Many countries did. But well, here's what you don't know, and I may get an argument, but my father told me this. And then I've talked to a lot of Jews. You know who else didn't mind that the Germans would come to Eastern Europe? The Jews. The Jews didn't mind. And do you know why? They're dealing with a population in Eastern Europe of a history of 1,000 years of pogrom, of violence, and violence and ignorance. Ignorance and brutality. Now, you have a Western army coming in from Germany, civilized Germany. Yes, they read about the laws about intermarriage. Yes, you have to wear an armband. You have to wear a peaked hat in Venice in the 16th century if you were a Jew. They knew from their mothers, their grandmothers, their great-grandmothers, it's in their blood, it's in mother's milk, stories about laws that you're going to have, you're going to have restrictions, you're going to be able to have this job, not that job, you can't teach in that school, you got to go here. This was normal life for generations. and they're going to now have an army come in. It's going to be occupied by a Western force. Yes, they're right-wing fascists. Yes, they're anti-Semites. So what else is new? What else is new? They're going to be from the West. They're going to stop all pogroms. Guess what they did? They stopped all pogroms. There were no more pogroms when the Germans occupied Eastern Europe. And they didn't start their, yes, there were Einsatzgruppe going around killing people, but it wasn't organized, and they didn't start mass deportations till 1942, and they hadn't even yet had their conference in Wannsee yet. And they weren't really sure about how this was going to work. Yes, there were killings, and they began to see it in the streets, whether they're killing people, but this isn't anything new. They began slowly to realize it. Even by 1941, they would run into the Rebbe's, shtetl synagogue, like this one, and they'd say, "Me brennen Jeden!" They'd run away from a concentration camp and they'd yell, "Me brennen Jeden!" They're burning Jews. They're killing Jews. And they go, "They're Meshiga." These people who are coming to the synagogue and saying they're killing Jews, what are they, crazy? Yes, we can see there's violence on the streets. They're doing this, they're doing that. We're used to it. The Jews were used to it, for generations used to it. And so it was a shock. It was a real shock that a Western, yes, a right-wing Western, anti-Semites, so what else is new, I'm saying? But that they would organize this? That it would be a mechanized killing? It was beyond their comprehension because it wasn't in their history for 1,000 years. And only people who were back in the modern world, like my dad, who'd become an actor, who left that world, who said, even at the age of 24, says, "I believe it. I'm going to build a bunker. I'm not going to be ready. I'm going to be ready for deportation, which is why I'm here." And there were people who did. So that's and I don't like the generalizations of an entire nation, whether they're Ukrainians or Poles, be generalized about, oh yeah, these were innately anti-Semitic, brutal people. The Ukrainians, yes, absolutely, they were killing squad. Yes, they aided and abetted the Nazis, maybe more than other people. My father himself would say, "You know who was the worst? Not the Germans. Well, the worst was the Ukrainians." My father would say that to me. It wasn't until I got to Ukraine in 2015 where I heard the word Holodomor. I'm sure this audience has never heard this word, Holodomor. Who has? Raise your hand. Well, that's a small percentage of this audience. Holodomor, which is the deliberate murder of 6-7 million almost Ukrainians by Stalin through starvation, and wrongly attributed, the attitude of Eastern Europeans and Ukrainians was that the communists and Bolsheviks were Jews. And in fact, many of the more highly educated Jews were high up in the secret police in the communist world because of their education. So you have a reason beyond the Catholic Church, beyond Christ killers, for anti-Semitism in Eastern Europe, and especially in Ukraine, where there was mass genocide in the 1930s. It's not simple. There's no easy answer. It's not, to condemn. I know you weren't doing that. You were just stating facts. You were not condemning anybody. But the woman yesterday was condemning an entire culture.
Let's just
which I'm
say
not into.
The incorrect survivors have a perception, and your father stated, you hear it again and again, worse than the Germans were the Poles, worse than the Germans were the Ukrainians. No other country could have systematically done what was done except for the Germans. And that is that the Poles would have never been able to organize the entire apparatus in the way it was done. The Ukrainians collaborated. The Ukrainians collaborated with the Germans because they were promised independence from the Soviet Union.
Yeah.
10 years after the Holodomor, meaning the Holodomor occurred in the early 1930s. This is the early 1940s. They are promised independence. They did not get independence. They weren't going to get independence, but that was the lure which was used to turn them. Let me just conclude with one geographical thing. If you were a Jew living on the border between 1939 and 41, Poland was divided. It was divided along the Bug River. If you were a Jew living on the edge of the Bug River, and you had a choice between going to Soviet-held territory versus going to German-held territory. If you judged on the basis of history, the Germans were a benign occupier in World War I. The Russians were a harsh occupier in World War I, doing tremendous violence to women along the way in a very particular way. So if you judged by history, you stayed in the German areas, German occupied areas. If you understood what was unique and distinct about Nazism as a phenomenon, you went to the Soviet areas. Soviet area was a catastrophe for Judaism, anti-religious. It was deeply and problematic for capitalism and for Jewish entrepreneurship and for those who had businesses and the like, but it diminished the basic elements of anti-Semitism. And what you saw there is the entire tension in the early 1940s within the shtetl as to which direction they take.
Yeah.
You also saw the beginning, and this was also true of the question, and you hear this today, the women work, the men study. And that's the dividing line, a deep dividing line in Israel today in a very profound way.
That's why my mother married my father. She saw him dance a tango. And she didn't want to be the wife of a religious man and have 11,000 children, and wanted to be a modern woman. And she saw a modern guy with dressed modern, and he could dance a tango. And she said, well, that's going to be my husband. And he didn't know, she said, poor thing didn't know when she saw him dance at a wedding. But that was it. It was like that, exactly what you're saying. She didn't want to be a slave to somebody who claimed to be higher than everybody else because he, studied Talmud all day, and the woman had to work her ass off and do everything else. And she said, I'm not doing it. And that's why, and they wouldn't let him, her family wouldn't let him marry her. All in the telling.
Is it working? I want to thank you all for coming.